Every prison in America has two sets of rules. There's the official one, the one printed in the inmate handbook, enforced by guards posted on the walls of every cell block. Wake up at this time, eat at this time, don't fight, don't possess contraband, follow the orders of the correctional officers. And then there's the other set, the one nobody writes down, the one that gets passed quietly from one inmate to the next the moment a new arrival walks through the gate. This second set of rules is older than any of the men enforcing it. It doesn't care what the law says. It doesn't care what a judge decided. And in many ways, inside those walls, it carries more weight than anything the state could ever impose. This invisible code decides who eats first and who eats last, who gets respect and who gets nothing, who walks the yard freely and who can't step outside their cell without an escort. It sorts thousands of men into an order so rigid, so universally understood, that you could move someone from a prison in California to a prison in Florida, and the ranking would barely change. And at the very bottom of that order, beneath the murderers, beneath the armed robbers, beneath men who have done things most people can't imagine, there is one group, one category of prisoner that nearly every other inmate, regardless of their own crimes, has agreed to despise. The people convicted of harming children. Inside the walls they have a name for them, and from the second that label gets attached to someone, their entire experience of incarceration changes. They become targets in a place they cannot leave, surrounded by people the system has already deemed dangerous, living under a threat that follows them through every hallway, every meal, every transfer. So what actually happens to them in there? How does a population of convicted criminals, people with no legal authority and nothing to gain, enforce a moral hierarchy more consistently than the courts that put them there? And the most uncomfortable question of all, when the most hated people in the prison system suffer for what they did, is that justice finally arriving where the law couldn't reach? Or is it just more violence in a place already drowning in it? To understand any of that, you have to understand how the hierarchy works in the first place. Walk into any large prison in the United States and within hours you'd start to notice something. The population isn't a random mass of criminals thrown together. It's organized, quietly, invisibly, but organized. There's a structure to it that has nothing to do with the cell numbers or the housing assignments the administration hands out. The inmates have built their own society inside the one the state created. And like every society humans have ever formed, it has a top and a bottom, and a long ladder of rungs in between. At the top, you'll often find the men who command respect through reputation, the ones serving long sentences for serious violent crimes who carry themselves with a kind of authority. In many facilities, these are the people who have been inside the longest, who understand the system, who have connections that stretch beyond the walls. They've earned a status that the newer arrivals instinctively recognize. Below them, layer after layer, the enforcers. The hustlers who control the informal economy of cigarettes, food, and favors. The people who keep their heads down and serve their time quietly. The gang affiliates organized by their loyalties, each group with its own place, its own rules, its own understanding of where the lines are. But here's the thing that surprises people who have never looked closely at prison culture. The ranking isn't based on how dangerous you are. It isn't based on your sentence length or your body count or how feared you might be on the outside. It's based on the nature of your crime, and specifically on whether your crime violated the one rule that prison culture treats as absolute. In the world outside, we tend to think of all serious criminals as roughly equivalent in their badness. A murderer is a murderer, a criminal is a criminal, but inside that's not how it works at all. The men who have killed other adults, who have robbed, who have dealt drugs, who have committed acts of terrible violence, many of them have constructed an entire moral framework that allows them to live with what they've done. And that framework has one foundation stone: you don't hurt children. It's the line that almost everyone, no matter how far they've fallen, refuses to cross. And more importantly, it's the line they refuse to share a category with anyone who has crossed it. To a man serving life for killing a rival, the idea that he might be lumped together with someone who harmed a child is not just offensive. It's a threat to the only dignity he has left. This is the psychology that creates the bottom rung. The hierarchy needs a floor. It needs someone to be beneath everyone else, because that's how the men higher up define themselves as better. And prison culture has overwhelmingly, almost universally, decided who that floor will be: the people convicted of crimes against children. There's a word that gets used inside, several words actually that vary from region to region and facility to facility. But the function is always the same. The label marks someone as untouchable in the worst sense, not protected but condemned. The moment that word attaches to a prisoner, every other inmate knows exactly where they stand. And the information travels fast, faster than most people on the outside would believe. Prisons are dense networks of communication, despite every effort by the administration to control the flow of information. Inmates have access to news. They have visitors, they have lawyers, they read court documents, they recognize faces from television coverage. When someone new arrives, the questions start almost immediately. What are you in for? And the answer, true or not, spreads through the cell blocks within days. There's even a specific document that becomes dangerous, the paperwork that details a prisoner's charges and conviction. Inside, demanding to see someone's paperwork is a way of verifying their story, of confirming whether the new arrival is who they claim to be. Someone who refuses to show it, or whose paperwork reveals the wrong kind of crime, can find themselves marked instantly. This is why so many people convicted of these particular offenses arrive at prison already terrified. They know what's waiting, their lawyers have told them, other inmates have told them. The reputation of what happens to their category precedes them through the gate, and so the system has to do something with them, because a prison that can't keep its inmates alive has failed at its most basic function. The state took custody of these people. The state is responsible for them. Whatever they did, however much the public might not care what happens to them, the law requires that they survive their sentence. The answer the system landed on is called protective custody. Protective custody, or PC, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a separate housing arrangement designed to keep certain inmates away from the general population. It exists for several groups: former law enforcement who end up incarcerated, informants who have testified against dangerous people, high-profile prisoners whose fame makes them targets, people with debts they can't pay inside, and in large numbers those whose crimes have made them the focus of the prison's hatred. On paper, protective custody sounds like a solution. Move the vulnerable people somewhere safe, keep them separated, problem solved. But the reality of protective custody is far more complicated, and in many ways far darker than the simple name suggests. Because being protected inside a prison comes at a cost most people never consider, and the cost is steep enough that some inmates would rather take their chances in general population than accept what protective custody actually involves. To understand that choice and why anyone would make it, you have to step inside the protective unit itself. There's a common assumption about protective custody that needs to be corrected right away. People imagine it as something like a safer dormitory, a quieter wing where the vulnerable inmates can serve their time in relative peace, away from the threats. A reasonable trade, maybe even a comfortable one. The reality is closer to a prison within the prison. In many facilities, protective custody operates under conditions nearly identical to solitary confinement, not because the inmates have done anything to be punished further, but because keeping them separated from everyone else requires keeping them locked away from almost all human contact. The very thing that protects them is also the thing that isolates them completely. For many in protective custody, the day looks like this: 23 hours inside a cell, 1 hour out, often alone, sometimes in a small enclosed area for what's officially called recreation but amounts to pacing in a confined space. Meals delivered through a slot in the door. Showers a few times a week, escorted, scheduled, brief. Limited access to programs, to education, to the work assignments that help other inmates pass the time and reduce their sentences. The cell itself is small: a bunk, a toilet, a sink, sometimes a narrow window, sometimes none at all. The walls are close. The door is solid, and the hours stretch out in a way that's almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't lived it. Think about what that actually means: day after day, month after month, sometimes year after year. Human beings are not built for this. We are social animals to our core, our brains developed over hundreds of thousands of years in the constant presence of others. Remove that and something starts to break down. Researchers who study the effects of prolonged isolation have documented what happens to the human mind under these conditions, and the findings are consistent and disturbing. Anxiety that builds into panic, depression that deepens into something darker. Difficulty thinking clearly, difficulty remembering, difficulty holding on to a sense of time. Some people begin to experience perceptual disturbances. Some develop a kind of hypersensitivity to sound and light. Some withdraw so completely that they stop responding to the world around them at all. The psychological literature on solitary confinement and extreme isolation has reached a near consensus on this point. Extended isolation causes real, measurable harm to mental health. And while protective custody is technically not the same as punitive solitary confinement, the conditions are often so similar that the effects overlap almost entirely. The person in protective custody experiences the isolation just as deeply, even though they're there for their own safety rather than as punishment. This creates a cruel paradox. The system promises to protect these inmates from physical harm, and it delivers on that promise by subjecting them to a different kind of harm, one that doesn't leave visible marks but can devastate a person just as thoroughly. Some inmates in this situation describe a slow erosion of their sense of self. With no one to talk to, no meaningful interaction, no real stimulation, the mind starts to turn inward in ways that aren't healthy. Time loses its shape. The future becomes unimaginable. The past replays endlessly. For someone already carrying the weight of what they've done, that endless replay can become its own form of torment. And here's the part that makes protective custody such a difficult bargain. Even after all of that, even after accepting the isolation and the deprivation and the psychological cost, the protection it offers is not absolute. Protective custody reduces risk. It does not eliminate it. The problem is that prisons are enormous, complex systems run by overworked, understaffed teams of people. And anywhere there are people and systems, there are gaps. There are moments when the careful separation breaks down, moments when the wall between the protected inmate and the population that wants to harm them thins or disappears entirely. Consider the simple matter of movement. A protected inmate cannot stay in their cell forever. They have medical appointments, court dates, visits with lawyers, transfers between facilities, and every time they move they have to leave the protective unit and travel through the larger prison, where the careful separation becomes much harder to maintain. Consider the matter of staffing. Protective custody depends entirely on the staff knowing who needs protection and from whom. That knowledge has to be recorded accurately, communicated clearly, and acted on consistently by every single officer involved. One clerical error, one miscommunication during a shift change, one new officer who doesn't know the situation, and a protected inmate can suddenly find themselves exposed. Consider the matter of other inmates. Even within protective custody, there can be tension. The unit holds different kinds of vulnerable prisoners, and they don't always coexist peacefully. A former informant and someone convicted of a despised crime might both be in protective custody, but that doesn't mean they're safe from each other. The hierarchy follows people even into protection. And consider the most basic problem of all: information travels. The same networks that spread word of someone's crime through the general population can reach into the protective unit. Inmates working in the kitchen, in the laundry, in the maintenance crews move between areas. They carry messages. They carry knowledge. The idea that protective custody seals someone off completely from the rest of the prison is, in practice, a fiction. So the protected inmate lives in a strange limbo, isolated enough to lose their mind, but not isolated enough to be truly safe, caught between two kinds of suffering with no good option available. Some choose to leave protective custody and return to general population, deciding that the psychological toll of isolation is worse than the physical risk of exposure. It's a desperate calculation, and it tells you everything about how unbearable the isolation can become. When someone decides that the danger of being among people who want to hurt them is preferable to the safety of being alone, you understand that protective custody is not the simple solution it appears to be. And for those who stay, the question always hangs in the air. What happens when the protection fails? When the gap opens up, when the separation breaks down, when the system that promised to keep them safe simply doesn't? Because it does happen, more often than the official statistics would ever fully capture. This is the part of the story that people both want to hear and don't. There's a grim fascination with what happens when prison protection collapses. It's the subject of countless conversations, countless rumors, countless dark jokes, and underneath that fascination is something more uncomfortable, a sense for some people that when it happens it might be deserved. I'm going to walk through how these failures occur, because understanding the mechanics matters more than the outcomes themselves. But I want to be clear about something first. What follows are composite scenarios drawn from documented patterns across the prison system over the decades. No names, no specific cases, because the point isn't to celebrate any particular incident. The point is to understand how a system designed to prevent harm ends up enabling it again and again. The failures tend to happen in predictable places. The gaps in protection are not random. They cluster around specific moments and specific weaknesses, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. The first and most dangerous gap is transport. When an inmate has to be moved, whether between facilities to a court appearance or to a medical center, they leave the controlled environment of their housing unit and enter a far more chaotic space. Transport often means being placed in a shared vehicle or a holding area with other inmates. The careful separation that protective custody maintains inside the unit becomes nearly impossible to maintain in transit. Imagine a protected inmate loaded into a transport van with several others for the long drive to a court hearing. The officers are focused on security, on preventing escape, on managing a group of restrained prisoners. They may not know or may not have been told that one of the men in their custody is marked, and the other inmates packed into that confined space have hours to figure out who they're sitting next to. The intake process is another notorious failure point. When someone first arrives at a facility, there's a window of time before they're properly classified and housed. During that window, they may be held in general intake areas, processed alongside the broader population before the system has flagged them for protection. A new arrival whose reputation has preceded them can be identified and targeted before they ever reach the safety of the protective unit. Then there are the administrative failures, the paperwork that doesn't get processed correctly, the protection request that sits in a queue, the transfer that places someone in a facility where their status isn't properly communicated. Each of these is a small bureaucratic failure, the kind that happens constantly in any large institution. But in a prison, a small failure can have enormous consequences. Consider a scenario that has played out in various forms across the system. An inmate is granted protective custody at one facility. The protection is working, but then they're transferred for any number of routine reasons: overcrowding, a program assignment, a medical need. The transfer paperwork is supposed to flag their protected status to ensure the receiving facility continues the protection. But somewhere in the process, the information is incomplete or delayed or simply missed. The inmate arrives at the new prison and is placed in general population because the staff there have no idea that they're supposed to be protected. By the time the error is discovered, the damage may already be done. There's also the problem of deliberate failure, which is the hardest part to discuss. The prison system runs on the cooperation of its staff, and staff are human beings with their own opinions and their own moral judgments. The overwhelming majority of correctional officers do their jobs professionally and protect every inmate in their care regardless of the crime. But the system depends on that professionalism being universal, and it isn't always. There have been documented situations across the long history of American corrections where protection failed not because of an accident but because someone chose to let it fail. A door left unlocked, a patrol that didn't happen, a warning that was ignored. These are the rarest and most troubling failures because they represent the system turning against the very people it's obligated to protect, and they're nearly impossible to prove, which is part of why they persist. The mechanics of these failures reveal something important. The danger to this population is not a single event but a constant condition. It's present in every transfer, every appointment, every shift change, every piece of paperwork. The protected inmate lives inside a web of potential failures, any one of which could expose them. And the longer their sentence, the more times they roll those dice. What actually happens when the protection fails, I'm not going to describe it. The details are not the point, and dwelling on them would cross a line this story doesn't need to cross. What matters is the outcome. The prison system in these moments fails at its most fundamental duty. A person in state custody is harmed because the state could not or would not keep them safe, and here's the consequence that ripples outward. When these failures happen, they don't just affect the individual, they reinforce the entire culture. Every successful act of violence against this population sends a message through the prison. The hierarchy is confirmed, the code is enforced, the bottom rung stays at the bottom. The next vulnerable inmate who arrives faces a culture that has just been reminded of its own power. This is why the violence is so persistent and so difficult to stop. It isn't the work of a few isolated individuals. It's woven into the social fabric of incarceration itself. The administration can build all the protective units it wants, can write all the policies it wants, but it's fighting against a value system that the inmate population has built and maintained for generations. And the system fights that battle with limited resources, chronic understaffing, aging facilities, and overcrowding that makes proper separation nearly impossible. In a prison operating at well over its intended capacity, with too few officers watching too many inmates, the gaps multiply. The failures become not just possible but probable. There's a bitter irony at the center of all this. The protective custody system exists precisely because everyone knows what would happen without it. The system has effectively admitted that it cannot keep these inmates safe in general population, which is an admission that the prison environment is fundamentally dangerous for them. And yet the alternative it offers, the isolation that breaks the mind, is its own form of harm. The system is trapped between two failures, choosing the lesser one and calling it protection. Before we go further into why this happens, why a population of criminals enforces this code so relentlessly, I want to pause for a second. If you're finding this breakdown of the prison system valuable, take a moment to subscribe. This channel covers the hidden machinery of crime, punishment, and justice every week, the things that happen behind walls most people never see. Your subscription helps these stories reach more people who want to understand how the system actually works. Now let's get into the harder question, the psychological one, because the failures of the system explain how this violence happens, but they don't explain why an entire population of convicted criminals has decided to make it happen. Here's what genuinely puzzles people when they first encounter this aspect of prison culture. The men enforcing this code are not, by any conventional measure, good people. They are, by definition, convicted criminals. Many of them have committed serious acts of violence. Some have killed, some have spent their lives causing harm to others. These are not the people we'd normally expect to take a moral stand about protecting the innocent, and yet they have constructed and maintained one of the most consistent moral codes you'll find anywhere in human society. More consistent, arguably, than the legal system that put them away. So what's actually going on here? Why do hardened criminals draw this particular line and defend it so fiercely? The answer turns out to be a window into human psychology itself. The first piece of it is about identity and self-image. Every human being needs to believe they are not the worst version of themselves. We all construct narratives that allow us to live with our actions, that preserve some core sense that we are fundamentally not monsters. For a person who has committed terrible crimes, that narrative becomes essential to psychological survival, and the easiest way to maintain it is to find someone worse. When a man serving a long sentence for a violent crime looks at someone who harmed a child, he sees a creature he can define himself against. I may have done terrible things, the reasoning goes, but I would never do that. I have a code. I have limits. I am not like them. The despised inmate becomes a mirror that reflects back a flattering image. By condemning them, the criminal affirms his own remaining humanity. This is why the hatred is so intense and so universal. It's not really about the victims of the crime, though the inmates would frame it that way. It's about the criminals' need to believe in their own moral flaw. The bottom rung of the hierarchy exists because everyone above it needs there to be a bottom rung. Remove it, and the entire structure of self-justification collapses. The second piece is about power and control. Prison is an environment defined by powerlessness. The inmates have lost almost everything: their freedom, their autonomy, their ability to make even the smallest decisions about their own lives. They are told when to wake, when to eat, when to sleep, when to move. In that vacuum of control, the inmate-created hierarchy becomes one of the only domains where they have any power at all. Enforcing the code is an exercise of that power. It's a way of saying the state may control everything else, but we control this. We decide who matters and who doesn't. We have our own system of justice and we administer it ourselves. For people stripped of all other agency, the ability to enforce the prison's moral order is intoxicating. It restores a sense of meaning and authority in a place designed to strip both away. The third piece is about belonging. Prison is a dangerous place, and survival often depends on alliances, on being part of a group, on demonstrating that you share the values of the people around you. Participating in the code, or at least endorsing it, is a way of proving membership. It's a shared value that binds the population together. To stand against the code, to defend the despised, would be to mark yourself as an outsider, possibly even as someone with sympathies that put you on the wrong side of the line. The pressure to conform is enormous. The fourth piece is the displacement of guilt. Many incarcerated people carry profound, often unexamined guilt about their own actions. That guilt is painful, and the human mind looks for ways to discharge it. Directing anger and moral outrage at someone else, someone designated as worse, provides a release. The despised inmate becomes a vessel for all the self-hatred and unresolved shame that the population can't face directly. Punishing them is, in a twisted way, a punishment of the self by proxy. It allows the criminal to feel righteous without ever confronting his own crimes. When you put all of these together, identity, power, belonging, and the displacement of guilt, you start to understand why this code is so deeply embedded and so resistant to change. It's not a rule imposed from outside. It serves real psychological functions for the people who enforce it. It gives them a sense of moral worth, a feeling of control, a way to belong, and a release for their guilt. The code survives because it does so much work for the people who live by it. But there's a deeper layer here that's worth sitting with because it complicates the whole picture. The impulse behind the code is not entirely foreign to the rest of us. The protective instinct toward children, the visceral revulsion at those who harm them, is one of the most universal human responses there is. It exists across cultures, across history, across every kind of human society. When people on the outside hear about these crimes, they feel a version of the same rage that drives the prison code. The difference is that on the outside, that rage is channeled through the legal system, restrained by due process, mediated by institutions. Inside the prison, those restraints are gone. The rage is the same, but the institutions that contain it have disappeared. What you're seeing in prison justice is, in a sense, the raw human impulse without the civilizing structures we've built around it. It's what retribution looks like when you strip away the courts, the laws, the careful procedures we use to keep our darker urges in check. And that's what makes it so unsettling to think about, because part of us understands it. Part of us, hearing about a crime against a child, feels the pull of that same instinct. The prison code is a distorted, dangerous, lawless version of something most people carry inside them. It's the shadow of our own sense of justice, acting itself out in a place where nothing stops it. This is the genuinely difficult moral territory. We want to condemn the violence, and we should. Vigilante punishment in prison is illegal, dangerous, and corrosive to everything a justice system is supposed to stand for. It punishes people without trial, based on rumor as often as fact. It empowers the worst impulses of the worst people. It makes prisons more violent and less rehabilitative for everyone. And yet, when we hear about it, many of us feel something other than pure condemnation. A flicker of grim satisfaction, a sense that some kind of cosmic balance has been restored. That feeling is worth examining because it reveals something about how fragile our commitment to justice by process really is. The moment the crime is horrible enough, a part of us is willing to abandon the principles we claim to hold. The prison population has simply taken that willingness to its logical conclusion. They've built an entire system around the idea that some crimes are so far beyond the pale that the perpetrators forfeit the protections we extend to everyone else. And the question that leaves us with is uncomfortable. Are they wrong? Or are they just doing openly what a part of us secretly wishes the system would do? There's no clean answer to that. And anyone who offers you one is selling something. What we can say is that the psychology of prison justice is not as alien as it first appears. It runs on the same emotional machinery that drives our own moral judgments. It's just been let loose in a place with no rules, no oversight, and no mercy. The result is a system that satisfies a deep human craving for retribution, while violating everything we claim to believe about how justice should work. Which brings us to the final and most important question: what does all of this actually accomplish? When the dust settles, when the sentences are served, when the people involved either get out or don't, what's left? Is anyone better off? Has anything been made right? Or is this just suffering piled on suffering, accomplishing nothing but its own perpetuation? Let's follow the threads to where they actually led. Start with the people at the center of all this. The ones convicted of these crimes who spend their sentences as the lowest rung of the prison hierarchy. What happens to them in the long term? For many, the experience compounds whatever damage was already there. A person who enters prison with serious psychological problems, and many in this population do, leaves it worse. The isolation of protective custody, the constant fear, the dehumanization, none of it addresses the underlying issues that led to the crime in the first place. If the goal of incarceration includes any hope of preventing future harm, the prison experience for this group works against it. People who are brutalized and isolated do not emerge healthier or safer. They emerge more damaged, more disconnected, and in some cases more dangerous than when they went in. This is the practical argument against prison justice that often gets lost in the emotional response. Whatever satisfaction the violence provides in the moment, it doesn't make the eventual release any safer. The vast majority of incarcerated people, including many in this category, will one day be released. The question of what kind of person walks back out into society is not abstract. It affects real communities, real potential victims, and a system that produces more broken, more volatile people is not protecting anyone in the long run. For the perpetrators of prison violence, there are consequences too, though they often go unexamined. Inmates who attack others, even attacks the broader population might quietly approve of, face additional charges, extended sentences, time in disciplinary segregation. The man who enforces the code may add years to his own incarceration in the process. The cycle of violence consumes the enforcers as well as their targets. Nobody in this dynamic comes out ahead. And then there's the cost to the system itself. Every act of violence triggers investigations, lawsuits, administrative scrambling. Prisons have been held legally liable for failing to protect inmates in their custody, including inmates the public has little sympathy for. The law does not stop applying just because a prisoner committed a terrible crime. The state's obligation to keep people in its custody alive and unharmed is a legal duty, and when the system fails that duty, it pays. Those costs are borne by taxpayers, by the institutions, by the staff who have to manage the fallout. So when you add it all up, the ledger of prison justice looks grim from every angle. The victims of the original crimes are not helped by it. The perpetrators are not rehabilitated by it. The enforcers bleeds resources because of it, and the broader society inherits people who have been made worse rather than better. By almost any practical measure, the violence accomplishes nothing constructive. It only perpetuates itself, and yet the debate doesn't end there because not everyone evaluates this in practical terms. There's a school of thought, held quietly by more people than would admit it openly, that says some things shouldn't be measured by their utility. That certain crimes are so monstrous that the suffering of those who commit them is its own kind of moral accounting, regardless of whether it rehabilitates anyone or makes society safer. To this way of thinking, the prison hierarchy is delivering a rough, ugly form of the justice that the formal system is too constrained to provide. It's not pretty, but it's deserved. The opposing view, the one most legal scholars and human rights advocates hold, is that this thinking is a trap. The whole point of a justice system, they argue, is to remove punishment from the realm of raw emotion and personal vengeance. The moment we accept that some prisoners deserve to be harmed outside the law, we've abandoned the principle that makes justice different from mere revenge. We've said that the protections of the system are conditional, that they can be revoked for sufficiently hated individuals. And history shows that once you accept that logic, the category of people who don't deserve protection has a way of expanding. There's also the simple matter of accuracy. The prison hierarchy operates on rumor, on paperwork, on reputation. It does not conduct trials, it does not weigh evidence. People have been targeted inside based on accusations that were exaggerated, misunderstood, or simply false. The formal justice system, for all its flaws, at least attempts to determine guilt before imposing punishment. The prison code skips that step entirely. It punishes the accused as readily as the convicted. And in a system where wrongful convictions are a documented reality, the prison hierarchy occasionally inflicts its harshest punishments on people who didn't even do what they're accused of. These are the competing arguments, and I'm not going to pretend to resolve them for you. The tension between the desire for retribution and the principles of due process is one of the oldest and deepest in all of human ethics. It doesn't have a tidy answer. Reasonable people, thoughtful people, land on different sides of it, and they always have. What I'd ask you to take away from all of this is something more modest than an answer. It's an awareness of the machinery. Behind the walls of every prison in this country, there's a society operating by its own rules, enforcing its own hierarchy, administering its own brutal version of justice. It exists in the gaps the official system can't fill. It thrives on the isolation, the overcrowding, the understaffing, the bureaucratic failures that define so much of American incarceration. And it raises questions that don't stay safely behind those walls, about what we actually want prison to be, punishment or rehabilitation or simple containment, about whether the protections of the law should apply to everyone or only to those we deem worthy, about the gap between the justice we say we believe in and the retribution we secretly crave, about what it means that the most consistent moral code in the entire system is one enforced not by the state, but by criminals. The people at the bottom of the prison hierarchy are there because of choices they made, choices that caused real harm to the most vulnerable victims imaginable. Nothing in this story asks you to forget that or to feel sympathy you don't feel. But the way the system handles them, the isolation, the failures, the violence, says something about us too, about the kind of justice we've built, and the kind we've quietly allowed to exist alongside it. A prison is supposed to be the place where society's response to crime is made orderly, lawful, and controlled. The hidden hierarchy inside reveals how incomplete that control really is. And the lowest rung of that hierarchy, the most hated people in the system, end up showing us not just who they are, but who we are when we think no one is watching. That's the part worth sitting with long after this video ends. If this gave you a new way of seeing what happens behind prison walls, the video on screen breaks down another hidden system most people never get to see. Take a look.